Have you ever heard someone yell, not out of anger, but out of desperation, as if their voice was the only thing standing between silence and being understood? Today's story begins with a sound that made an entire restaurant freeze. It was jarring, uncomfortable, even unacceptable to some. But what happened next revealed a hidden kind of courage most people never dare to show. If you believe that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't always look polite, but it changes everything, then hit like, tap subscribe, and stay with us. Because here, we don't just tell stories people want to hear. We tell the ones they need to. The restaurant was quiet, too quiet. Nestled between two sleek office towers in Midtown Manhattan, Shenzhen was the kind of place where silence was part of the service. Every footstep was muted by tatami mats. The servers moved like shadows, and even the soft tinkling of ceramic teacups was muffled by design. It was an oasis for those who valued peace, subtlety, control. At table 7 sat Harrison Miles, 60 years old, the billionaire founder of an audio engineering empire. To outsiders, he was a man who had perfected the science of sound. But what few understood was that Harrison didn't just create acoustics, he lived inside them. His apartment was padded and minimal, free from echo or static. Even his watch ticked silently. He feared noise the way others feared chaos. And nothing in his life, not even his son, Eli, had ever been louder than he could tolerate. Eli, 8 years old, was pale and anxious, slumped in his seat beside his father. After a head injury 6 months prior, the boy had lost his hearing, a condition doctors described as temporary, though progress had been slow. He now wore a small bone conduction hearing device over his left ear. It was new, sensitive, unfamiliar. And today, something was off. His fingers trembled in his lap, knuckles white. He kept one hand pressed tightly over the side of his head, the other curled around the edge of the table. Harrison barely glanced at him. Across the room, Rita Solis watched from behind the server station. She had seen children like Eli before, in another life, long ago, before everything fell apart. Before the complaint. Before she was forced out of her path as a speech therapist. Now she wore an apron instead of a lanyard, and held a notepad instead of flashcards. Still, old instincts didn't fade. Rita approached the table cautiously. Her voice was soft, respectful, as all employees were trained to be in a sound-sensitive environment. "Would you like me to start with the tea options?" But she stopped mid-sentence. Eli was shaking. Not dramatically, not enough for most to notice. But she saw it. A subtle rock in his shoulders, a desperate squeezing of his eyes. Someone at the next table dropped a fork. The small clatter echoed just enough. Eli gasped and threw both hands over his ears. His body stiffened. He looked like he was underwater, struggling to hear something that wouldn't come, or to block something that wouldn't stop. Rita took one step back. Harrison's eyes didn't move. He sat rigid, unreadable, as if detachment was the only way he knew how to offer protection. For a moment, Rita stood frozen between her uniform and her training. Then she made a choice. She stepped forward, knelt to Eli's eye level, and said, loudly, clearly, firmly, "Eli, do you want me to help you or not?" The sound exploded into the room. Chopsticks stopped in midair. A spoon clinked loudly back into a bowl. A man at the sushi bar turned around. Two women paused their conversation mid-sentence. Silence returned, but now it wasn't peaceful. It was electric. Eli's eyes widened. His breath hitched. He looked up. Not at the ceiling. Not at the wall. At her. Rita held her gaze. Her expression didn't apologize. Her hands didn't flutter in defense. There was no excuse in her posture, only presence. Only that one question, still hanging in the air, waiting to be answered. From across the table, Harrison's head turned so sharply it could have cracked. His expression wasn't anger, not yet. It was closer to shock. Confusion. disbelief that anyone would dare raise their voice within his meticulously designed bubble, let alone direct it at his son. But Eli wasn't shrinking. His arms lowered slightly. His lips parted. The moment hung like static. Then, a blink. A tiny nod. Just once. And Rita smiled, just a little. The silence that followed Rita's shout was thick, not with anger, but something deeper. It was the kind of silence that asked a question no one was ready to answer. Eli sat frozen. His chest rose and fell rapidly, but for the first time that morning, his eyes weren't darting around in panic. They were focused, locked onto Rita. There was a tremble in his lower lip, the kind that precedes either tears or something much harder, speech. Rita didn't move. She didn't glance around the room to gauge the reaction of onlookers. She didn't turn to Harrison for permission or forgiveness. And most of all, she didn't apologize. Her feet stayed planted, her back straight, her eyes gentle but firm. She lowered herself to one knee, slowly, deliberately, and leaned forward just enough so Eli could see her lips move clearly. "You heard me, didn't you?" she asked, her voice softer now, but still direct. Eli blinked. Once. Then again, faster. As if processing a foreign language that was somehow, suddenly, familiar. He nodded. Barely. But it was a nod. A real one. And Rita smiled, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. She didn't cheer or praise or reach out to touch him. She just let the moment breathe. From the corner of her apron, she pulled out a small notepad, the same one she used to scribble specials and customer requests. With the back of the pen, she flipped to a clean page. Then, with a few fast strokes, she drew a simple sketch, a sine wave, jagged and looping across the paper like a roller coaster in ink. At the bottom, she drew a tiny ear, then traced a line from the wave to the ear. Next to it, she pointed to her own lips. Then to Eli's ears. Then to his mouth. Eli watched every motion. There was still tension in his posture, but curiosity had begun to bloom in the corners of his face. Rita didn't say anything. She just tapped the paper once, then tapped her chest. "Your turn," she whispered, barely audible. Then she mouthed the sound. "RRRRR." Eli's fingers twitched against his lap. He looked at the sketch again, then at her. "RRRRR." It was soft. Barely more than a growl. But it was there. His first sound of the day. Rita didn't flinch. Didn't clap. Didn't overreact. Instead, she gently placed the pen on the table and nodded once, a mirror of his earlier gesture. "Try again," she mouthed. Eli sat up straighter. "RRRRR," he said again, clearer this time, his voice scraping through his throat like a rusted hinge trying to open. At the next table, someone cleared their throat awkwardly. A waitress by the bar whispered something behind her hand. Harrison remained frozen, one hand hovering above the table, unsure whether to interject or stay silent. But Rita ignored all of it. Her world, in that moment, was only the boy in front of her. Eli leaned forward, eyes on the notepad now. He reached out slowly, hesitantly, and traced the wave with one finger. Then he looked up, uncertain. Rita gave him a tiny thumbs up. He smiled. It was small, crooked, fragile, but it was the first one she had seen from him. And it didn't need to be explained. The moment shattered as suddenly as it had begun. With a sharp scrape of chair legs against the floor, Harrison Miles stood up. The refined hush of the restaurant recoiled at the movement, loud not in volume, but in meaning. He didn't shout. He didn't glare. But the tension in his jaw, the rigid line of his back, and the quiet rage in his voice spoke louder than any outburst ever could. "Manager," he said, not even looking around. His voice sliced through the room with surgical precision. The floor manager, a younger man in a black suit, appeared almost instantly at his side. He had been watching everything from a distance, unsure whether to intervene. Now, faced with one of the most powerful clients in their book, his decision became obvious. Harrison didn't raise his voice, but everyone heard him. "I want her gone," he said, his eyes locked on Rita. "Effective immediately." The manager hesitated. "Mr. Miles, perhaps we can." "She yelled at my son," Harrison snapped, his voice finally cracking with the edge of outrage. "I don't need someone screaming at Eli to prove they matter." His words hit like cold wind. Precise. Condemning. Dismissive. Rita stood still, not flinching, not shrinking. She didn't apologize. She didn't try to argue. She didn't ask to explain herself. But there was no defensiveness in her posture, either, only clarity. Quiet resolve. The manager turned to her, eyes awkward and low. "I'm sorry, Ms. Solis. We'll need to suspend you for the remainder of your shift. Please gather your things." A few nearby patrons avoided eye contact. A couple whispered behind napkins. Eli sat motionless in his chair, watching everything with wide eyes, but still no tears, no panic. Just alertness. Rita nodded once. No protest. No fuss. She reached into her apron and pulled out the notepad she had used with Eli, carefully tearing out the page, the one with the sound wave and the little ear and the path between them. She took a step toward Harrison's table and placed it gently in front of his untouched cup of tea. Then she looked him in the eye, not with challenge, but with something quieter. Sadder. Stronger. "He doesn't hear your voice," she said calmly. "But he heard mine. Because I was willing to speak louder than my fear." The words hung in the air like a low-frequency hum, the kind that stays long after the sound has stopped. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. With quiet grace, Rita turned and walked away, her apron loose at her sides, her steps light but unwavering. The page on the table fluttered slightly in the still air, the sketch staring up at Harrison like an accusation, or a lesson. Harrison didn't move. Didn't sit back down. Didn't reach for the paper. He just stood there, surrounded by silence, a silence of his own making, and for once it didn't feel peaceful. It felt empty. The quiet had returned to Shenzhen, but something was different. A few days had passed since the incident. The buzz had faded, the murmurs silenced, and the regular clientele had settled back into their usual rhythms. Yet when Eli Miles walked through the door again, hand tucked into his father's, the entire staff straightened just a little, not out of fear but curiosity. The boy looked smaller. Not in size, but in presence. He moved like a shadow beside Harrison, shoulders hunched, eyes glued to the floor. The hearing device was still clipped over his ear, but it didn't seem to comfort him. If anything, it seemed to weigh him down. They were seated at the same table, table 7, with the same quiet lighting and the same hand-folded napkins. Harrison nodded to the manager, gave a curt thank you, and settled in, pulling out his phone but not unlocking it. Eli sat beside him, stiff and still. A new server approached with practiced grace, placing down 2 menus without speaking. Harrison glanced up and gave a polite nod. Eli didn't lift his eyes. The server returned moments later with water. She placed the glasses gently on the table, one in front of Harrison, the other in front of the boy. Her hands were steady, professional. She turned to go. And that's when it happened. Tap. Tap tap. Tap. 3 soft knocks on the wooden table. Then 2. Then 1. 3, 2, 1. The rhythm was unmistakable, or at least it would have been, to someone who'd heard it before. The server paused mid-step, puzzled, then glanced back. But Eli wasn't looking at her. He wasn't looking at anyone. His gaze stayed downcast, locked on the water glass in front of him. One finger rested lightly on the table's surface. Tap. Tap tap. Tap. Same rhythm. She tilted her head slightly, then turned to Harrison. He didn't offer an explanation. Instead he watched his son, closely, but from a distance, as if unsure how to approach whatever was happening. Tap. Tap tap. Tap. The sound wasn't loud. It wasn't disruptive, but it had intention. Harrison leaned in a little. "Eli?" he asked. No response. Tap. Tap tap. Tap. The same pattern Rita had used days earlier, when she drew the wave, when she guided him through the first sound. A rhythm not taught, not explained, but shared. No one else in the restaurant seemed to notice. To them, it was just a child fidgeting at a table. But Harrison saw something else, a message, a reach. Eli still wouldn't look up. He didn't meet his father's eyes. He didn't acknowledge the server. He didn't speak. But he tapped. Over and over. And something about the sound, soft, steady, stubborn, filled the space more than any voice could. The server, unsure, offered a quiet, "Is everything all right, sir?" before stepping back. Harrison nodded vaguely, not taking his eyes off his son. He didn't answer her. Because the truth was, he didn't know. He didn't know if everything was all right. He didn't know if Eli was trying to remember or trying not to forget. He only knew that the boy wasn't looking at anyone, not out of rudeness, not out of fear, but because something inside him had folded inward again. And Harrison couldn't reach it. Not with silence. Not with politeness. Not with the carefully curated world of quiet he had built around them both. He sat back slowly, folded his hands, and listened. Tap. Tap tap. Tap. That night, the apartment was silent, not by accident, but by design. Every corner of Harrison Miles' penthouse was engineered for quiet, soundproofed walls, custom flooring, zero reverberation. The hum of the refrigerator was dampened. The vents released air with a whisper. Even the soft click of light switches was nearly inaudible. He had built his life this way, to avoid noise, to control disruption, to stay ahead of chaos. But now, as he stood in the hallway outside his son's room, that silence felt different. Eli had gone to bed early. No protest, no delay, just a quiet shuffle toward his room, a glance back, then the slow closing of the door. Harrison hadn't followed. He had lingered in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of untouched tea, staring into nothing. Something about the rhythm, the tapping earlier, kept looping in his mind like a forgotten song. He finally walked to Eli's room and knocked once gently. No answer. He pushed the door open. The boy was asleep or close to it, curled on his side, facing the wall, the hearing device still clipped gently over his ear. The room was dimly lit by the faint glow of a night light, casting a soft haze over the bookshelves, the desk, the bedspread covered in faint star patterns. Harrison stepped inside quietly, as if afraid his own presence might wake the quiet. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Forgiveness? A sign? An opening? Instead, his eyes landed on the hearing aid. It looked ordinary. The same model they had tried weeks ago. But something about it caught the light. He leaned in. There, barely visible, etched in what looked like faded marker, were 3 words. "You heard me." His breath caught. He blinked. It wasn't factory engraving. It wasn't medical instruction. It was messy. Handwritten. Imperfect. And unmistakably human. He reached out slowly and tilted the device, careful not to wake Eli. The words curved along the edge, nestled beside the tiny speaker grill. He remembered it now, the moment that waitress Rita had reached for the device. The pen in her hand. The look on her face. Back then, he hadn't seen what she'd done. He had been too angry. Too offended. Too busy defending the silence. Now, in the hush of his own home, the words struck harder than any shout. "You heard me." Eli stirred slightly, and his hand reached up in his sleep, brushing over the device. Then, without opening his eyes, he pointed once to the inscription, then tapped the side of his head, just behind his left ear. His left ear. The side he hadn't used for weeks. Harrison's throat tightened. The boy wasn't awake. Not fully. But somehow, He knew. He was showing him. Showing that he remembered. That it mattered. That the voice that broke the rules had broken through, not just into his ears, but into something deeper. And that now, this side, the left, the side where the message lived, was the one he trusted. Harrison's vision blurred. He covered his mouth with one hand and turned away slightly, but it was no use. Tears came. Not in a wave, not in a collapse, but in slow, quiet drops, like rain hitting the inside of a glass dome. He had built his life to avoid noise. But this? This wasn't noise. This was truth. And it was louder than anything he had ever designed. The community center was modest. Old linoleum floors, scuffed walls painted pale yellow, and a faint smell of dry erase markers clinging to the air. There was no sign announcing what it offered, just a paper flyer taped to the inside of the glass door: speech and sound, free language support classes, all ages welcome. Harrison Miles had never stepped inside a place like this. He held the door open for Eli, who walked ahead with his usual caution, eyes scanning the unfamiliar hallway. There were faint voices down the corridor, children giggling, chairs shifting, the occasional tap of markers on whiteboards. It was, in a quiet way, alive. Harrison didn't speak. He didn't know what to say. He had spent days replaying that moment, the tapping, the hearing aid, the words etched into the device. And now, he stood here not to fix something, or to control something, but to ask something. They reached the classroom at the end of the hall. The door was ajar. Inside, Rita Solis was kneeling beside a boy no older than 6, helping him shape a word with exaggerated movements of her mouth. The child's fingers moved uncertainly across a laminated card. Another child sat at a nearby table, clapping softly each time someone made a sound. Rita looked up when she saw them. Her face registered surprise, but not discomfort. Just curiosity. She stood slowly. Harrison stepped inside and nodded politely. Still, he said nothing. Instead, he pulled a folded piece of paper from the inside of his coat, not the notepad Rita had used, but something new, handwritten in black ink, crisp and clean. He unfolded it in front of Eli and handed it to him. The words were simple. "Would you like her to stay?" Eli blinked. His eyes flickered between the paper and Rita. Then he looked back at his father. And nodded. No hesitation. No confusion. Just a firm, quiet nod. Rita exhaled softly, something between relief and gratitude filling her posture, but she didn't move. Then Eli reached for a nearby marker and flipped the paper over. He scrawled a sentence in wobbly handwriting, uneven but determined. But no more yelling. The moment hung in the air, heavier than any apology. Rita laughed, not out of mockery, but with warmth. Real warmth. "Deal," she said, her voice gentle but clear. "No more yelling." Eli smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It didn't need to be. It was a bridge. A beginning. Harrison looked between the two of them and, for the first time in a long time, allowed himself to relax, just a little. Not because everything was fixed, but because something had finally started to heal. The room was built for sound, not to dampen it, but to celebrate it. Inside the newly opened Speak Up Lab, everything from the textured walls to the open beam ceiling had been designed with purpose. The acoustics were warm, resonant. It wasn't a sterile space. It was human. Alive. Designed for children who had spent too long being spoken at instead of listened to. Parents, educators, therapists, and supporters filled the folding chairs lining the event hall. The audience had gathered for the lab's official launch, a joint initiative founded by Harrison Miles and Rita Solis, born from two very different worlds colliding in one unforgettable moment. Together, they had created a space where children with hearing impairments could find their voice, not just through devices, but through courage, connection, and community. A simple wooden podium stood at the front. No flashy graphics. Just a microphone and a banner above that read, "Speak Up Lab, find your frequency." Harrison stood to the side, dressed in his usual muted tones, hands behind his back. He didn't speak to the crowd. He didn't need to. He had spoken with his actions. Rita sat in the front row, her hair tucked behind one ear, smiling gently, nervously. She had declined the offer to speak. This wasn't about her. It was about Eli. The boy stepped onto the small platform with the shy stiffness of a child, trying not to trip over his own importance. He was 9 now, only a year had passed, but the difference was visible. He stood straighter. His hands were steady. His hearing device gleamed under the warm light, now fitted with a small orange sticker shaped like a sound wave. The room quieted. No music. No prompting. Eli looked around, then up at the microphone. It was adjusted to his height, but he still leaned toward it slowly, as if it might retreat. He didn't speak right away. And no one rushed him. He glanced at his father, then at Rita. Then he looked at the crowd. And with a voice just above a whisper he said, "If you can't hear me, I'll try louder." The words were simple, but the impact? Instant. People froze. Breath caught. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was reverent. Every person in that room was listening. Not just with their ears, but with their hearts. And then, applause. It started from one corner, then two, then all at once. The entire room erupted into a standing ovation. Hands clapped, some wet with tears. People cheered, shouted, laughed, embraced. Eli didn't flinch this time. He smiled, wide and real. And this time, when the sound surrounded him, he didn't cover his ears. He stepped into it. In a world that often values silence over discomfort, we sometimes forget the power of raising our voice, not in anger but in care. This story reminds us that being heard is not the same as being understood. Young Eli couldn't process the world through sound the way others did, but through one bold, unexpected act, someone reached him. Not by whispering politely, but by daring to speak louder than fear. As we age, it's easy to believe that control and peace come from keeping things quiet, from avoiding confrontation, from smoothing every wrinkle in the day. But the truth is, growth rarely happens in perfect stillness. Sometimes, healing begins with a disruption. Sometimes, a breakthrough is wrapped inside a moment that feels too loud, too messy, too human. We must also remember the children around us, the ones struggling to find their voice, and the ones we might silence unintentionally with our expectations. Listening doesn't always mean waiting for a sound. It means watching, being present, allowing space for imperfect expression. And finally, the story reminds us that it's never too late to change, not just for ourselves, but for those we love. A billionaire who spent his life perfecting sound learned to listen not with his ears, but with his heart. That is a lesson for every age. So if you find yourself in silence that no longer soothes, ask yourself, is it peace or avoidance? And if someone needs you to speak louder, don't be afraid to try. Have you ever been called too loud, when all you really wanted was to be heard? Have you ever had to raise your voice, not out of anger, but just to feel seen, if only once? If that's ever been you, don't leave without hitting like and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. Because here, we tell the stories that don't always whisper, but always matter. And in the comments below, tell us. Have you ever had to break the silence with your own voice, just to finally be heard?